As lockdown here in the UK is eased and many are going back to work, there are those that are asking how we're going to pay for the coronavirus bill. This week, I spoke to Grace Blakeley, author and economist, to find out more. Check it out.
This economic crisis is kind of unlike anything we've ever really seen in history because it results from the determined cessation of economic activity imposed from the outside. It's had a very immediate and severe effect, really of the kind that we haven't seen in the history of modern capitalism on most major economies. The long-term impact of this really is going to depend upon the links between how long the lockdown goes on, what impact that has on incomes and revenues for businesses, and what impact that has on debt repayments. And all of that is in part going to be determined by what the state does. So you can see already the state doing a lot of stuff to try and protect people's incomes, to try and protect businesses, to make sure that we don't get into the situation where everyone's defaulting and the whole economy collapses. There are a set of things that the government needs to do to make sure that people and businesses don't become insolvent. But there are lots of questions about how it does that and I suppose the outcomes that result from it. Even the stuff that's been put in place up to now probably hasn't been expansive enough, and it certainly hasn't really been kind of democratic enough. We're giving away all this money to big businesses and we aren't really asking for anything in return. It's kind of like what happened in the wake of the financial crisis. You have big bailouts and then no demands around, making sure these businesses are environmentally sustainable, making sure they're treating their workers well, all these sorts of things. There's a balance here between the spread of the disease and potentially increasing the number of deaths and obviously the long-term economic impact. But the difference is, of course, that the state can do a lot to mitigate the long-term economic impact. So we can stay in lockdown, and if the state were to, say, nationalize some of the businesses that were struggling and start kind of properly planning economic activity, if the state was to kind of make sure that incomes were protected across the board, kind of significantly mitigate the impact on the economy and also support both workers and kind of smaller businesses. What we've seen since the 1980s, it's been rather than the state taking on debt and providing kind of universal services, individuals have been encouraged to take on debt, pay interest to private banks, take out mortgages, etc., which has created this kind of financialized economy that we have today. So I can imagine a situation in which the government says, right, yes, we do need to take on a bit more debt to make sure that, everyone doesn't become insolvent. But ultimately, over the long term, we want to go back to the situation where the government doesn't have too much debt. Businesses and households are encouraged to have a significant amount of that. Do we want to have a situation where lots of households and businesses owe lots and lots of money to private banks, to private creditors? Or do we want to have a situation in which the government, which doesn't have to pay very high interest rates at all, and is much less expensive for it to service, and that gets paid off over a long period of time through tax revenues? So if the economy grows, tax revenues go up, and the government find its debt burden more sustainable. Again, it's this question of who pays, who has to actually end up bearing the burden of these costs that undoubtedly are going to arise. And we are going to see, I think, a big push that is actually working people who are ultimately forced to bear the burden, just as they were in the aftermath of the financial crisis. And that's something that we obviously really have to push back against. We really have to think about whether or not we want to structure the recovery from this as, right, let's go back to normal, because normal was not good. A big part of the reason that this crisis has been so bad was because of the pre-existing fragilities that there were in the global economy before it emerged. So environmental breakdown, high levels of debt, high levels of inequality. And how do we build an economy that is more sustainable over the longer term? I think there will be a realization of, right, okay, we used all these resources to cope with the coronavirus. Why should we not be doing the same thing for the climate crisis, which is, arguably, well, it is a much more significant threat to humanity and to human life over the long term. And based on that, I think, the best way to recover from this crisis when the lockdown is lifted, when we start to kind of see the light at the end of the tunnel, will be to say, we know that this crisis, this lockdown, the coronavirus will have a long-term economic impact. The state will need to spend not just to keep the economy going during the crisis, but to recover it afterwards so that the economy grows again. That will require some sort of kind of post-crisis stimulus program. The question obviously is, Will a Conservative government do that? I think it's highly unlikely. So that really is going to be something that we're going to have to fight for, I think.
With the newly extended furlough scheme costing around £14 billion a month at the moment, there's no doubt that there's going to be a huge bill at the end of this pandemic. But as Grace says, the question is, who's going to pay for it? We know that studies conducted showing that at least 130,000 people died because of austerity. The death toll here in the UK is currently rising, hitting almost 50,000 at the moment. And yesterday, a report was released that shows that deprivation, race, poverty, and inequality were the biggest drivers of poor outcomes from coronavirus. It all asks the question, can we really afford another round of austerity? Are the working people of this country really going to have to shoulder this burden once again? That's all we've got time for this week. Please come again next week and remember to like and subscribe everywhere. Thank you.